Imagine being told you don't belong in your own classroom. That's exactly what happened to Ms. Thompson, a dedicated black teacher who found herself facing relentless discrimination from her new principal. As the days turned into weeks, Ms. Thompson's once vibrant spirit began to dim under the weight of racist comments and unfair treatment. But little did the principal know, Ms. Thompson's mother was about to become his worst nightmare. Ms. Thompson's fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed down her blazer, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. With one last glance at her reflection in the car window, she strode towards the imposing brick facade of Jefferson High School. The hallways bustled with activity as Ms. Thompson made her way to the main office. Students chattered excitedly, their voices echoing off the lockers lining the walls. She couldn't help but notice the sea of faces around her, a stark contrast to her own. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of her stomach as she realized she was the only person of color among the staff she'd seen so far. As she approached the teacher's lounge to grab a quick coffee before her first class, hushed voices drifted through the partially open door. Another diversity hire, she caught the tail end of a whisper, followed by a derisive snort. Ms. Thompson's steps faltered, her hand freezing on the doorknob. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to push through and enter the room with her head held high. Conversations abruptly ceased as she walked in, replaced by a tense silence. Ms. Thompson felt the weight of sideways glances and barely concealed stares as she poured her coffee with shaking hands. She managed a tight smile and a quiet, "Good morning," before retreating from the suffocating atmosphere. Her meeting with Principal Johnson did little to ease her growing discomfort. His handshake was perfunctory, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as he welcomed her to Jefferson High. "We run a tight ship here, Miss Thompson," he said, his voice clipped and cold. "I trust you'll be able to keep up with our rigorous standards." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Ms. Thompson's voice was steady as she replied, "Of course, Principal Johnson. I'm looking forward to contributing to Jefferson High's excellent reputation." But inside, doubts began to gnaw at her confidence. As she made her way to her classroom, Ms. Thompson fought to push aside her concerns. She focused instead on the lesson plans she'd spent weeks perfecting, on the eager young mind she was about to shape. This was her passion, her calling. She wouldn't let anything dampen her enthusiasm for teaching. The first period bell rang, and students filed into the room. Ms. Thompson took a deep breath, centering herself. As she launched into her carefully prepared introduction to Kill a Mockingbird, her earlier unease began to fade. The students leaned forward, engaged by her passionate delivery and thought-provoking questions. By the time the final bell rang, signaling the end of her first day, Ms. Thompson felt a mix of emotions washing over her. Pride in how well her lessons had gone warred with the lingering worry about fitting in with the staff. As she packed up her things, she couldn't shake the feeling that her journey at Jefferson High was going to be far more challenging than she'd anticipated. Still, as she looked around the empty classroom, imagining the potential contained within its walls, a small smile tugged at her lips. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, she was determined to overcome them. For herself, and for every student who would pass through her classroom doors. Little did Ms. Thompson know, her resolve was about to face its greatest challenge yet. As the initial excitement of the new school year faded, a chill settled over Jefferson High. Friendly smiles became strained, casual invitations dried up, and whispered conversations ceased the moment she entered a room. Something had changed, but what? A month into the semester, Ms. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling of isolation creeping into her daily routine. The once welcoming atmosphere had shifted, leaving her adrift in a sea of familiar faces that now seemed distant and cold. She found herself eating lunch alone more often than not, her invitations to join colleagues met with vague excuses and averted gazes. The change was subtle at first, barely perceptible. But as days turned into weeks, the reality of her situation became impossible to ignore. Conversations in the teacher's lounge would abruptly halt when she entered, only to resume in hushed tones once she left. Even Mr. Davis, the only other black teacher on staff, seemed to be avoiding her, his usual friendly nod replaced by a quick glance and hurried steps in the opposite direction. Principal Johnson's behavior towards Ms. Thompson took on a more overt shift. What began as occasional comments about her lesson plans evolved into near-constant criticism. He nitpicked every aspect of her teaching style, from her classroom management to the way she explained complex literary concepts. His voice, laced with thinly veiled contempt, echoed in her mind long after their meetings ended. "Ms. Thompson, your approach is too unconventional for our students," he'd say, his lips curled into a dismissive smirk. "Perhaps you should consider a more traditional method of instruction." These encounters left Ms. Thompson questioning her abilities, her confidence wavering with each passing day. She pored over her lesson plans late into the night, second-guessing every decision, every activity she had meticulously crafted for her students. The passion that once fueled her teaching began to flicker, threatened by the constant barrage of doubt and criticism. One afternoon, as Ms. Thompson was gathering her things to leave, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Two teachers, unaware of her presence just around the corner, were discussing recent hires. "You know why she's really here, don't you?" one voice said, dripping with disdain. "It's all about filling quotas. They don't care if she can actually teach or not." The words hit Ms. Thompson like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and shaken. She leaned against the wall, her mind reeling as she tried to process what she'd just heard. Was that truly how her colleagues saw her? As nothing more than a token hire, her qualifications and passion for teaching dismissed entirely? Confusion and self-doubt threatened to overwhelm her as she drove home that evening. The sudden shift in the school's atmosphere, the increasing hostility from Principal Johnson, and now this revelation, it all swirled in her mind, a dizzying maelstrom of uncertainty and hurt. But as she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of ungraded papers before her, something within Ms. Thompson began to harden. A spark of defiance ignited in her chest, growing stronger with each passing moment. She may be facing an uphill battle, but she refused to let their prejudices define her worth as an educator. With renewed determination, Ms. Thompson threw herself into her work. She stayed late into the evening, meticulously grading papers and refining her lesson plans. Each perfectly crafted assignment, each thoughtful comment in the margins of an essay became a silent rebuttal to those who doubted her abilities. As she finally packed up her things, the school long since emptied of students and staff, Ms. Thompson felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. She was unaware of the even greater challenges that lay ahead, but in that moment, her determination burned bright. She would prove her worth, not just for herself, but for every student who deserved an educator who believed in their potential. The intercom crackled to life, Principal Johnson's voice cutting through the quiet buzz of Ms. Thompson's classroom. "Ms. Thompson, please report to my office immediately." Her students exchanged worried glances as she tried to maintain a calm facade, excusing herself with a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As she walked down the empty hallway, Ms. Thompson's heart raced. She'd been expecting this confrontation, but that didn't make it any easier. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on Principal Johnson's door, steeling herself for what was to come. "Come in," his voice rang out, cold and unwelcoming. Ms. Thompson entered, her back straight and chin held high despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. Principal Johnson sat behind his imposing desk, his face a mask of stern disapproval. "Ms. Thompson," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "I've been observing your classes, and I have some serious concerns about your teaching style." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "It's far too urban for our students here at Jefferson High." The word urban hung in the air between them, its racist undertones unmistakable. Ms. Thompson felt a surge of anger and humiliation, but she fought to keep her voice steady as she responded. "With all due respect, Principal Johnson, my methods have been highly effective. My students' engagement levels have significantly increased, and their test scores have shown marked improvement." She reached into her bag, pulling out a folder of carefully compiled data. "I've brought some statistics that clearly demonstrate " Principal Johnson waved his hand dismissively, cutting her off. "Numbers can be manipulated, Ms. Thompson. What I'm concerned about is the overall tone you're setting in your classroom. It's simply not a good fit for our school culture." Ms. Thompson's fingers tightened around the folder, her knuckles turning white. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean by tone, sir. My students are learning, they're engaged, and they're developing critical thinking skills. What I mean," Principal Johnson said, leaning forward, his voice low and threatening, "is that you need to tone down your personality. Be less, you. Our students need structure, discipline, not all this touchy-feely nonsense you're peddling." The words hit Ms. Thompson like a physical blow. She recognized the thinly veiled racism in his critique, the implication that her blackness was somehow detrimental to her students' learning. Anger bubbled up inside her, threatening to spill over. For a moment, she considered reporting this incident. Surely, such blatant discrimination couldn't be allowed to stand. But as quickly as the thought came, fear extinguished it. She needed this job, and making waves could easily lead to her termination. Who would believe her word against that of the esteemed Principal Johnson? Swallowing her pride and her rage, Ms. Thompson nodded stiffly. "I'll take your feedback into consideration, sir," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "See that you do," Principal Johnson replied, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. As Ms. Thompson left the office, the weight of the unfair treatment settled heavily on her shoulders. She made her way back to her classroom, each step feeling like lead. The hallway stretched before her, suddenly seeming endless and hostile. Pausing outside her classroom door, Ms. Thompson took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She could hear her students inside, their voices a comforting reminder of why she was here. For now, she decided, she would keep quiet and focus on her students. They were the reason she became a teacher, and she wouldn't let Principal Johnson's prejudice affect the quality of their education. With a heavy heart but a determined spirit, Ms. Thompson opened the door and stepped back into her classroom, ready to continue the lesson as if nothing had happened. As Ms. Thompson crossed the threshold, she felt the weight of two worlds collide. Behind her lay a realm of prejudice and pain, but before her stood a sanctuary of potential and promise. What would unfold in this classroom that could possibly counterbalance the crushing weight of discrimination she'd just endured? The eager faces of her students greeted her, their eyes bright with curiosity and anticipation. Ms. Thompson took a deep breath, allowing the familiar scent of chalk dust and textbooks to wash over her. Here, within these four walls, she could almost forget the tension that permeated the rest of Jefferson High. As she launched into the day's lesson on To Kill a Mockingbird, Ms. Thompson felt her spirits lifting. She poured her heart and soul into every word, determined to make the characters and themes come alive for her students. Yet, despite her best efforts, a shadow of her recent confrontation with Principal Johnson lingered. Jamal, a bright-eyed boy with a quick wit, raised his hand. "Ms. Thompson, are you okay? You seem different today." The concern in his voice was echoed in the faces of several other students, including Sarah, who nodded in agreement. Ms. Thompson's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized her internal turmoil was so visible. Forcing a smile, she replied, "I'm fine, thank you for asking. Now, let's focus on the chapter we just read." As the class delved into a group project analyzing the themes of racism and injustice in the novel, Ms. Thompson found herself struggling to maintain her usual enthusiasm. The parallels between the fictional world of Macomb County and her own experiences at Jefferson High were uncomfortably close. The students, however, seemed more engaged than ever. Their discussions grew heated, voices rising with passion as they debated the characters' actions and motivations. Sarah, usually quiet, spoke up forcefully about the unfairness of Tom Robinson's trial. "It's not right," she declared, her eyes flashing. "Just because he's black doesn't mean he's guilty. Why can't people see past skin color?" Her words struck a chord with Ms. Thompson, who felt a sudden lump in her throat. She looked around the room, seeing the fire of understanding in her students' eyes. They got it. They truly understood the message of the book, and more importantly, they cared. As the bell rang signaling the end of class, Ms. Thompson felt a renewed sense of purpose wash over her. The challenges she faced outside this room suddenly seemed less daunting. Her students' passionate engagement had reignited the spark that Principal Johnson's words had threatened to extinguish. Watching her students file out, still deep in animated discussion about the book, Ms. Thompson allowed herself a genuine smile. This was why she became a teacher. This was what truly mattered. She began tidying up the classroom, her movements more purposeful than they had been in weeks. The road ahead would undoubtedly be difficult, but in this moment, Ms. Thompson felt a steely determination settle in her chest. She would persevere, not just for herself, but for every student who walked through her door. They deserved nothing less than her absolute best, regardless of the challenges that awaited her beyond the classroom. The camaraderie of the teacher's lounge had always been a source of comfort for Ms. Thompson. But lately, something felt off. Conversation seemed to die as soon as she entered the room, replaced by meaningful glances and awkward silences. What whispers were spreading through the halls of Jefferson High, and at what cost to Ms. Thompson's hard-earned reputation? As Ms. Thompson approached the lounge one morning, the usual chatter inside abruptly ceased. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, heart racing. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. A hush fell over the room, and she felt the weight of her colleagues' stares as she made her way to the coffee machine. "Good morning," she said, forcing a smile. A few murmured responses reached her ears, but most of her fellow teachers suddenly found their phones or papers utterly fascinating. Ms. Thompson's fingers trembled slightly as she poured her coffee, the silence in the room almost deafening. As the days passed, the whispers grew bolder. Snippets of conversations reached her ears, each one a dagger to her professional pride. "I heard she only got hired because of affirmative action," one voice said. "My son says her class is a joke," another chimed in. "She probably can't handle the curriculum." The isolation intensified. Teachers who had once greeted her warmly in the hallways now averted their eyes or found urgent errands in the opposite direction. Lunch invitations dried up entirely, leaving Ms. Thompson to eat alone in her classroom, surrounded by empty desks and the echoes of her students' voices. One afternoon, as she was grading papers in the faculty workroom, two teachers entered, engrossed in conversation. They didn't notice Ms. Thompson in the corner, partially hidden by a bookshelf. "Did you hear about Thompson's latest stunt?" one of them said, voice dripping with disdain. "She's claiming Johnson's feedback was racially motivated. Can you believe it? Always playing the race card when things don't go her way." The other teacher scoffed. "Typical. She can't handle constructive criticism, so she cries racism. It's people like her who make it impossible to have an honest conversation about performance." Ms. Thompson's chest tightened, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She wanted to stand up, to confront them, to defend herself. But fear and shock kept her rooted to the spot, silent and invisible. The toxic environment began to take its toll. Ms. Thompson found herself constantly on edge, jumping at every whisper or sidelong glance. Her usual enthusiasm for teaching dimmed, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that followed her from home to school and back again. Sleepless nights left her exhausted, struggling to focus on lesson plans and grading. One particularly difficult day, Ms. Thompson found herself in the parking lot after school, fighting back tears as she fumbled for her car keys. A gentle touch on her shoulder made her start. "Rough day." Mr. Davis, the only other black teacher at Jefferson High, stood beside her, concern etched on his face. "The dam broke." Words poured out of Ms. Thompson, a torrent of frustration and pain she'd been holding back for weeks. Mr. Davis listened, nodding in understanding, his own eyes reflecting a shared experience. "You're not alone in this," he said softly when she finished. "I've been through it too. It's exhausting, always being the other, always having to prove yourself twice as hard." Their conversation provided a moment of relief, a validation of Ms. Thompson's experiences that she'd been desperately seeking. But as she drove home that evening, the weight of the situation settled back onto her shoulders. The whispers would continue tomorrow, and the day after that. How long could she endure in this hostile environment before something had to give? Ms. Thompson's resilience had been tested for weeks, but nothing could have prepared her for the storm brewing at tomorrow's staff meeting. As she pulled into the school parking lot, a chill ran down her spine. Something in the air felt different, dangerous. Little did she know, this day would push her to her absolute limit. The staff room buzzed with nervous energy as teachers filed in for the monthly meeting. Ms. Thompson found a seat near the back, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her notebook. Principal Johnson strode in, his face a mask of stern authority. As he began to speak, his gaze locked onto Ms. Thompson with an intensity that made her stomach churn. "Before we begin our regular agenda," Principal Johnson announced, his voice cutting through the room, "I'd like to address a pressing matter concerning our performance standards." He paused, his eyes never leaving Ms. Thompson. "It has come to my attention that certain teachers are inflating grades to appear more successful." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Ms. Thompson as Principal Johnson continued his verbal assault. "Ms. Thompson, your recent performance evaluation shows an unusual spike in student grades. Care to explain how your students suddenly became academic prodigies overnight?" Ms. Thompson's heart raced as she struggled to find her voice. I can assure you, Principal Johnson, that my students' success is a result of their hard work and my teaching methods. I've implemented new strategies strategies. Principal Johnson interrupted, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Or perhaps you've simply lowered your standards to make yourself look better." The accusation hung heavy in the air, leaving Ms. Thompson reeling. She tried again to defend herself, her voice trembling. "That's not true. I would never compromise my integrity or my students' education. If you look at their test scores and class participation enough," Principal Johnson cut her off sharply. "We'll discuss this further in private. For now, let's move on to more productive matters." Ms. Thompson sat in stunned silence as the meeting continued around her. She could feel the stares of her colleagues, a mix of pity and discomfort on their faces. Not a single voice was raised in her defense. The isolation she'd felt for weeks crystallized into a crushing weight on her chest. As soon as the meeting adjourned, Ms. Thompson bolted from the room. Tears blurred her vision as she hurried down the hallway, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere. She burst through the school doors, gulping in the cool morning air. In the sanctuary of her car, the dam finally broke. Sobs racked her body as months of pent-up frustration and pain poured out. Ms. Thompson gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as she tried to regain control of her emotions. Through her tears, a realization dawned: she couldn't face this alone anymore. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone. Her finger hovered over the contact list before settling on the one person she knew would understand, the one who had always been her rock. "Mom." Her voice cracked as her mother answered. "I need your help. I can't do this anymore." As Ms. Thompson poured out her heart, recounting the humiliation and discrimination she'd endured, she felt a small spark of hope ignite. She wasn't alone in this fight. And with her mother's wisdom and support, maybe, just maybe, she could find the strength to stand up against the injustice that had plagued her for far too long. The phone trembled in Ms. Thompson's hand as her mother's calm voice filled the line. Mrs. Angela Thompson's stillness belied years of experience in the Ministry of Education, a wealth of knowledge that might just be the lifeline her daughter desperately needed. As Ms. Thompson recounted the humiliation she'd endured, her voice cracked with emotion, the pain of each discriminatory incident fresh in her mind. Mrs. Thompson listened intently, her brow furrowing as she absorbed the details of her daughter's ordeal. The staff room whispers, Principal Johnson's thinly veiled racist remarks, the isolation, it painted a picture all too familiar in the world of education. When Ms. Thompson finished, a heavy silence hung between them. "Sweetie," Mrs. Thompson began, her voice gentle but firm, "what you're experiencing is unacceptable. But we need to be smart about how we handle this." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "Start documenting everything. Every comment, every incident, every witness. We need concrete evidence. Ms. Thompson's stomach churned at the thought. But Mom, what if someone finds out? I could lose my job. They'll label me a troublemaker, and then what? No school will want to hire me. Mrs. Thompson's voice softened, filled with understanding. I know you're scared, baby. But remember who you are, where you come from. Our family has been fighting for civil rights for generations. Your great-grandfather marched with Dr. King. Your grandmother integrated her school. This fight is in your blood. Tears welled up in Ms. Thompson's eyes as she listened to her mother's words. The weight of her family's legacy settled on her shoulders, both a burden and a source of strength. But what if it's not enough, she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. It might not be, Mrs. Thompson admitted. Speaking out always comes with risks. But staying silent, that has consequences too. It allows the discrimination to continue, not just for you, but for every teacher and student who comes after you. They discussed the potential fallout, the possibility of retaliation, the strain it could put on Ms. Thompson's career, the emotional toll of fighting such a battle. But they also talked about the potential for change, the chance to make Jefferson High a better place for everyone. As the conversation drew to a close, Ms. Thompson felt a mix of fear and determination settling in her chest. Okay, she said, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks. I'll start documenting everything. That's my girl, Mrs. Thompson replied, pride evident in her voice. And remember, you're not alone in this. I'm here for you, every step of the way. We'll face whatever comes next together. Ms. Thompson ended the call, her heart racing with a cocktail of emotions. The task ahead seemed daunting, but for the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone. As she reached for a notebook, ready to start recording every painful detail, a small spark of hope flickered to life. Whatever happened next, she knew she had the strength of generations behind her, and a mother's unwavering support by her side. The crisp pages of a new notebook held more power than Ms. Thompson could have imagined. With each entry, she was unknowingly building a case that would not only challenge Principal Johnson but expose a system of discrimination that ran far deeper than anyone suspected. What hidden truths would emerge as the pages filled? Ms. Thompson's hand trembled slightly as she opened the leather-bound journal, its pristine pages a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside her. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before putting pen to paper. The weight of her mother's words echoed in her mind as she began to meticulously document every discriminatory incident and conversation she'd experienced. Dates, times, and names flowed from her pen, each entry forcing her to relive the pain and humiliation she'd endured. She described the icy glares in the teacher's lounge, the hushed conversations that ceased the moment she entered a room, and Principal Johnson's thinly veiled racist remarks during staff meetings. As the pages filled, Ms. Thompson found herself struggling to maintain her composure at work, the raw emotions threatening to surface at inopportune moments. In the classroom, she poured her energy into her students, using their enthusiasm as a shield against the hostility that seemed to permeate the rest of Jefferson High. But even there, she couldn't escape the watchful eye of Principal Johnson. His classroom observations became more frequent, his criticisms more pointed. It was as if he sensed her newfound determination, and was determined to break it. One afternoon, as Ms. Thompson was grading papers in the faculty workroom, she overheard a conversation between two colleagues. They were discussing Principal Johnson's latest tirade against her teaching methods. For a moment, she considered confiding in them, sharing the burden of her secret documentation. But the fear of the information leaking held her back. She couldn't risk jeopardizing everything she'd been working towards. Weeks passed, and the journal grew thicker with each passing day. As Ms. Thompson flipped through the pages one evening, the full extent of the discrimination she'd faced hit her like a physical blow. The isolated incidents, when viewed together, painted a damning picture of systemic racism within Jefferson High. Her heart heavy with the weight of her discoveries, Ms. Thompson realized it was time to take the next step. She couldn't allow this injustice to continue, not just for herself, but for every teacher and student who might face similar treatment in the future. With trembling fingers, she reached for her phone, ready to make the call that would set in motion a chain of events that would change Jefferson High forever. As she dialed the number for the school district's HR department, Ms. Thompson's resolve strengthened. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and potential backlash. But as she clutched the journal filled with undeniable evidence, she felt a glimmer of hope. It was time to fight for justice, to make her voice heard, and to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had experienced. Ms. Thompson's fingers tightened around her evidence folder as she stepped into the HR office. The air felt thick with tension, and a question hung silently in the room: would justice prevail, or would her voice be silenced once again? The next hour would reveal just how deep the roots of discrimination had grown at Jefferson High. The HR representative, a middle-aged woman with a polite but distant smile, motioned for Ms. Thompson to take a seat. As she settled into the chair, Ms. Thompson felt her heart racing, but she forced her voice to remain steady as she began presenting her carefully documented evidence. "I've been experiencing ongoing discrimination and harassment at Jefferson High," Ms. Thompson explained, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened her folder. "I've documented every incident in detail, including dates, times, and witnesses when possible." The HR rep's eyebrows furrowed as she scanned the pages, her expression a mix of concern and skepticism. "Ms. Thompson," she began, her tone measured, "these incidents you've described are certainly troubling. But I have to ask, why did you wait so long to report them? This documentation goes back months." Ms. Thompson felt a knot forming in her stomach. She had anticipated this question, but the reality of answering it was more difficult than she'd imagined. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feared retaliation, losing my job. And part of me hoped that if I just worked harder, proved myself, things would improve on their own." The HR rep nodded, but her eyes held a hint of doubt. "I see. And you're certain these incidents were related to your race?" Sometimes, in high-stress environments like schools, normal workplace tensions can be misinterpreted. The suggestion hit Ms. Thompson like a physical blow. She felt her cheeks flush with a mix of anger and humiliation. "With all due respect," she said, fighting to keep her voice level, "I'm well aware of the difference between normal workplace stress and discrimination. When a principal tells you your teaching style is too urban for the students, that's not a misinterpretation." The HR rep's expression softened slightly, but Ms. Thompson could see the skepticism lingering in her eyes. As the conversation continued, frustration built within her. Each piece of evidence she presented was met with a subtle deflection or an alternative explanation that minimized the racial component. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding about Principal Johnson's feedback, the HR rep suggested at one point. "He has an excellent record with the district. I'm sure he didn't intend any offense." Ms. Thompson felt her hope dwindling with each passing minute. The mountain of evidence she had painstakingly gathered seemed to be crumbling under the weight of institutional denial. As the meeting drew to a close, the HR rep's words felt hollow and unsatisfying. "We take these matters very seriously, Ms. Thompson," she said, closing the folder. "We'll look into your concerns and follow up with you as soon as possible." As Ms. Thompson left the office, the vague promise echoing in her ears, a sobering realization settled over her. This battle for justice and equality was going to be far more challenging than she had anticipated. The system she had hoped would protect her seemed more interested in protecting itself. Stepping out into the afternoon sun, Ms. Thompson took a deep breath. The path ahead looked daunting, but she knew she couldn't give up now. Too much was at stake, not just for her, but for every educator who might face similar discrimination in the future. With renewed determination, she squared her shoulders and began the walk back to her car, already planning her next move in this unexpected war for equality. In the calm before the storm, Ms. Thompson had no idea of the hurricane that was about to engulf her. The school's atmosphere had shifted dramatically, and a single emergency staff meeting was about to turn her world upside down. How would she weather this unexpected tempest? The staff room buzzed with nervous energy as teachers filed in, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Ms. Thompson slipped into a seat near the back, her heart pounding as she felt the weight of covert glances. Principal Johnson burst through the door, his face a thundercloud of barely contained fury. The room fell silent as he strode to the front, his eyes sweeping across the assembled faculty before locking onto Ms. Thompson with laser-like intensity. "It has come to my attention," he began, his voice low and dangerous, "that certain individuals are attempting to tarnish the reputation of our esteemed institution with baseless accusations." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ms. Thompson felt her throat tighten as she realized the full impact of her formal complaint. Principal Johnson continued his tirade, each word a thinly veiled attack on Ms. Thompson's character and professionalism. She sat frozen, feeling the eyes of her colleagues boring into her. Some wore expressions of shock, others disappointment, but most avoided her gaze entirely, leaving her isolated in a sea of familiar faces turned suddenly cold. As the meeting adjourned, Ms. Thompson found herself alone in the crowd. Whispers followed her through the hallways, snippets of conversation reaching her ears. "Troublemaker," one voice hissed. "Always playing the race card," another added, the words cutting deep into her resolve. The day unfolded like a nightmare. Ms. Thompson arrived at her classroom to find her carefully crafted schedule in tatters. A hastily printed memo informed her of immediate changes, reassigning her to the most challenging classes in the school. She stared at the paper, her mind reeling as she realized the full extent of the backlash. Period after period, Ms. Thompson faced rooms full of disruptive students, many with behavioral issues that would challenge even the most seasoned educator. She fought to maintain order, her voice steady despite the chaos threatening to overwhelm her. With each difficult interaction, each snide comment from a passing colleague, she felt her energy draining away. As the final bell rang, Ms. Thompson sank into her chair, exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. She looked around the empty classroom, the events of the day replaying in her mind. The urge to give up, to retract her complaint and return to the uncomfortable but familiar status quo, was almost overwhelming. But as she gathered her things, a different emotion began to take hold. The faces of her students flashed before her eyes, not just those in her current classes, but the countless young minds that would pass through Jefferson High in the years to come. She thought of other educators, perhaps facing similar discrimination in silence, afraid to speak out. Ms. Thompson straightened her shoulders, a newfound determination flooding through her. The path ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges and hostility. But she knew now, more than ever, that this fight was bigger than just her own experiences. It was a battle for equality, for justice, for the very soul of education itself. As she locked her classroom door, Ms. Thompson took a deep breath, steeling herself for the days to come. The war had only just begun, but she was ready to face whatever storms lay ahead. For herself, for her students, and for every educator who deserved to be judged on their merits rather than the color of their skin. Ms. Thompson's heart raced as she watched her mother stride purposefully through the halls of Jefferson High. Mrs. Angela Thompson's presence commanded attention, her crisp suit and confident demeanor a stark contrast to the nervous energy that permeated the school. As they approached Principal Johnson's office, Ms. Thompson felt a mixture of hope and trepidation swirling in her chest. Mrs. Thompson knocked firmly on the door, her voice steady as she introduced herself. "Principal Johnson, I'm Angela Thompson, Ms. Thompson's mother and a senior official with the Ministry of Education. I believe we need to have a discussion about the ongoing situation at this school." Principal Johnson's face flickered with surprise, his usual dismissive demeanor faltering as he realized the potential implications of this unexpected visitor. He invited them in, his movements stiff as he settled behind his desk. The air in the office felt thick with tension as Mrs. Thompson calmly opened her briefcase. "I've reviewed the documentation my daughter has provided," Mrs. Thompson began, her tone measured but firm. "The pattern of discriminatory behavior and hostile work environment detailed here is deeply concerning." She spread out a series of papers, each one meticulously organized and highlighted. Principal Johnson's eyes darted nervously between the documents and Mrs. Thompson's unwavering gaze. "I assure you, Mrs. Thompson, we take any allegations of discrimination very seriously. However, I believe there may have been some misunderstandings. Mrs. Thompson held up a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. With all due respect, Principal Johnson, these incidents go far beyond misunderstandings. We're looking at potential violations of multiple anti-discrimination laws, not to mention the ethical implications for an educational institution. She proceeded to outline the legal and professional repercussions the school could face, her voice never rising but carrying the weight of years of experience in educational policy. Ms. Thompson watched in awe as her mother systematically dismantled each of Principal Johnson's attempts to downplay the situation. The ministry takes these matters extremely seriously, Mrs. Thompson continued, her eyes never leaving Principal Johnson's increasingly uncomfortable face. I strongly suggest we move forward with a formal investigation and mediation process. It's in everyone's best interest to address these issues transparently and thoroughly. Principal Johnson's shoulders sagged as the full weight of the situation settled upon him. After a moment of tense silence, he nodded reluctantly. Of course, Mrs. Thompson. We'll cooperate fully with any investigation. As they left the office, Ms. Thompson felt a complex mix of emotions washing over her. Relief that her struggles were finally being acknowledged warred with apprehension about the uncertain path ahead. She glanced at her mother, drawing strength from the unwavering support she saw reflected in those familiar eyes. The hallway stretched before them, suddenly seeming full of possibility rather than dread. Whatever came next, Ms. Thompson knew she wouldn't face it alone. With her mother by her side and the promise of a fair investigation, she allowed herself to feel a cautious spark of hope for the future of Jefferson High. The spark of hope that had ignited in Ms. Thompson's chest flickered uncertainly as she watched the independent investigator stride through Jefferson High's main entrance. The woman's crisp suit and determined gait sent ripples of unease through the gathered staff. Ms. Thompson's heart raced as she imagined the truths that might finally come to light. Over the next few days, a parade of teachers filed in and out of the conference room turned temporary office. Ms. Thompson sat rigid in her chair as the investigator asked pointed questions about the school's environment. She recounted every painful incident, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. As she spoke, she couldn't help but wonder how her colleagues were responding to the scrutiny. Her fears were not unfounded. In the staff room, hushed conversations revealed a divide forming among the teachers. Some, their eyes darting nervously, insisted they had never witnessed any discrimination. I've always found Principal Johnson to be fair, one teacher stammered, her fingers fidgeting with her coffee mug. Others, however, seemed emboldened by the investigation. Mr. Davis, who had once avoided Ms. Thompson's gaze, now spoke openly about the microaggressions he had endured. As more staff members shared their experiences, Principal Johnson's demeanor shifted dramatically. His usual confident stride gave way to agitated pacing, his face a mask of barely contained fury. He barked orders at the administrative staff and glowered at anyone who dared make eye contact. Ms. Thompson felt the weight of his anger acutely. Anonymous notes began appearing on her desk, their messages chilling. "Back off before you ruin everything," one read in jagged handwriting. Another warned, "Some things are better left alone." She gathered each note with trembling hands, adding them to her growing file of evidence. Despite the intimidation, Ms. Thompson refused to back down. She drew strength from the unexpected allies emerging from the woodwork. Sarah, a young English teacher, confided in her about the uncomfortable comments she had endured about her age and appearance. Even Mrs. Rodriguez from the math department, usually so quiet, shared a story of being passed over for a promotion in favor of a less qualified male colleague. As the investigation drew to a close, the atmosphere at Jefferson High crackled with tension. The investigators' promise of a comprehensive report within weeks did little to ease the uncertainty hanging over the school. Staff members eyed each other warily in the hallways, unsure of where allegiances truly lay. Ms. Thompson stood at her classroom window, watching students file out at the end of the day. She felt a complex mix of emotions, hope for justice, fear of retaliation, and a bone-deep weariness from the strain of it all. Whatever the report revealed, she knew that the road ahead would be far from easy. But as she turned back to her desk, straightening a pile of essays, she allowed herself a small smile. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone in her fight. The tension in the school board meeting room was palpable as Ms. Thompson took her seat. Her heart raced, a mix of anticipation and dread coursing through her veins. The investigation report lay before each board member, its contents about to shatter the carefully maintained facade of Jefferson High. As the meeting commenced, Principal Johnson strode to the podium, his face a mask of indignation. "This report is nothing but a collection of exaggerations and misunderstandings," he declared, his voice steady but laced with barely contained anger. "Ms. Thompson is a disgruntled employee, twisting innocent interactions into something sinister." Ms. Thompson's hands clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to maintain her composure. She watched the faces of the board members, searching for any sign of belief or doubt. To her surprise, shock rippled across their expressions as they delved deeper into the report. One board member, a woman with silver-streaked hair, looked up with wide eyes. "This goes far beyond a few isolated incidents," she said, her voice quavering. "We're looking at a systematic pattern of discrimination that has been allowed to fester for years." The room erupted into murmurs, and Ms. Thompson felt a surge of validation wash over her. She wasn't alone anymore. The truth was finally coming to light. As the meeting progressed, community members and parents stood to voice their support. A father, his voice thick with emotion, recounted his daughter's experiences of racism at Jefferson High. A longtime teacher, her hands shaking as she gripped the podium, shared her own story of witnessing discrimination but feeling powerless to stop it. The board's debate over potential consequences grew heated. Some argued for sensitivity training, insisting that education was the key to change. Others demanded immediate termination, their voices rising in anger at the injustices revealed in the report. Throughout it all, Ms. Thompson sat silent, her eyes never leaving Principal Johnson. She watched as his confident demeanor crumbled, replaced by a look of desperation as he realized the tide had turned against him. As the board prepared to vote, Ms. Thompson's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. "All those in favor of suspending Principal Johnson pending further review and potential termination, say aye." The chorus of ayes that followed was deafening. Ms. Thompson closed her eyes, relief washing over her in waves. When she opened them again, she saw Principal Johnson slumped in his chair, the fight gone out of him. As people began to file out of the room, offering congratulations and words of support, Ms. Thompson remained seated. The victory felt surreal, almost hollow in the face of the long journey that had led to this moment. She gathered her things slowly, her mind already racing ahead to the challenges that still lay before her. The suspension was a start, but there was so much work to be done to truly change the culture at Jefferson High. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Ms. Thompson took a deep breath. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The fight wasn't over, but at least now she knew she wasn't fighting alone. Victory's aftermath settled over Jefferson High like a heavy fog, obscuring the path forward. As Ms. Thompson walked through the school's main entrance, she felt the weight of countless eyes upon her. The familiar hallways seemed altered, charged with an electric mix of uncertainty and possibility. An interim principal, Dr. Amelia Carter, had been swiftly appointed to guide the school through this tumultuous period. Her first address to the staff was met with a cacophony of emotions. Some teachers nodded along eagerly, while others sat with arms crossed, skepticism etched across their faces. Ms. Thompson watched it all unfold, her heart racing as she realized the depth of the divide her actions had exposed. In the days that followed, Ms. Thompson navigated a minefield of interactions. Some colleagues approached her with tearful apologies, confessing their shame at remaining silent for so long. Others avoided her gaze entirely, their resentment palpable in the tense set of their shoulders. The staff room, once a place of casual conversation, now felt like a battleground of whispered allegiances and unspoken accusations. Guilt gnawed at Ms. Thompson's conscience as she witnessed the upheaval. Had she done the right thing? The question plagued her sleepless nights, even as she reminded herself of the injustices that had driven her to speak out. Her place in the school community, once so certain, now felt precarious and undefined. Dr. Carter wasted no time in implementing sweeping changes. Mandatory diversity training sessions were scheduled, and new inclusion initiatives were rolled out with dizzying speed. The reactions were as varied as the staff itself. Some embraced the opportunity for growth, while others grumbled about political correctness gone mad. Ms. Thompson found herself caught in the middle, alternately praised as a catalyst for change and blamed for disrupting the status quo. In her classroom, Ms. Thompson sought refuge from the storm raging beyond its walls. Her students, perceptive as ever, sensed the shift in the school's atmosphere. They peppered her with questions, their curiosity both a balm and a challenge. How could she guide them through these murky waters when she herself felt so adrift? Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the tides began to turn. Open dialogues about race and discrimination, once relegated to hushed corners, found their way into staff meetings and classroom discussions. The conversations were often uncomfortable, sometimes heated, but always necessary. Ms. Thompson watched with a mixture of pride and trepidation as her colleagues grappled with long-held beliefs and unconscious biases. As the weeks passed, Ms. Thompson found unexpected allies emerging from the chaos. Sarah, a young English teacher, became a steadfast friend, her unwavering support a beacon in stormy times. Even Mr. Davis, who had once kept his distance, now sought her out for advice on navigating the changing landscape of Jefferson High. One crisp autumn morning, Ms. Thompson paused at her classroom door, surveying the bustling hallway. The air felt different somehow, charged with a cautious optimism that had been absent for so long. As she watched students and teachers alike engaged in animated conversation, a small smile tugged at her lips. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in months, Ms. Thompson felt a sense of belonging slowly taking root once more. That fragile sense of normalcy shattered with a single envelope. Ms. Thompson's hands trembled as she read the notice, her mind reeling at the implications. How could a fight for justice lead to her becoming the accused? The courtroom loomed before Ms. Thompson, its imposing architecture a physical manifestation of the weight pressing down on her shoulders. She clutched her mother's hand tightly as they made their way through the crowd, reporters' questions buzzing in her ears like angry wasps. Their lawyer, a stern-faced woman named Patricia, ushered them quickly inside. As they settled into their seats, Ms. Thompson's eyes darted nervously around the room. Her gaze landed on Principal Johnson, sitting stoically across the aisle. His face was a mask of indifference, but she could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. The sight of him brought back a flood of painful memories, hushed whispers in the staff room, cutting remarks disguised as constructive criticism, the constant feeling of being an outsider in her own workplace. The legal proceedings dragged on for weeks, each day a fresh assault on Ms. Thompson's resolve. She relived every moment of discrimination in excruciating detail, her voice steady even as her heart raced. Nights were spent tossing and turning, doubts creeping in like shadows in the dark. Was this fight truly worth the toll it was taking on her life, her career, her very sense of self? One particularly grueling day, Ms. Thompson found herself sitting in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by relics of a simpler time. "I can't do this anymore, Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Maybe I should just drop the case, leave teaching behind. Find something easier." Mrs. Thompson sat beside her daughter, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Easier doesn't always mean right, sweetheart," she said softly. "Remember why we started this fight. It's not just about you anymore. It's about every teacher who's faced discrimination and stayed silent out of fear. It's about the students who deserve to see themselves represented in their classrooms." As the case progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Educators of color from across the country reached out to Ms. Thompson, sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. What started as a trickle soon became a flood of support, each message a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. The day of the verdict arrived, the air in the courtroom thick with tension. Ms. Thompson held her breath as the judge delivered the ruling, her mother's hand clasped tightly in hers. The words, "in favor of the plaintiff," sent a jolt through her body, relief and disbelief warring for dominance. As the implications of the verdict sank in, the damages awarded, the legal precedent set, Ms. Thompson felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her. There was joy, certainly, and a sense of vindication. But there was also a weariness that settled deep in her bones, a recognition of the long and difficult journey that had led to this moment. Standing on the courthouse steps, surrounded by supporters and flashing cameras, Ms. Thompson allowed herself a small smile. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. This victory wasn't just for her, it was for every educator who had ever felt silenced, every student who deserved to see themselves represented in positions of authority. It was a step, however small, towards a more just and equitable future in education. 1 year after the landmark court ruling, Ms. Thompson stood before her new class at Jefferson High, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. The classroom buzzed with energy as students settled into their seats, their curious eyes fixed on their teacher. Ms. Thompson took a deep breath, steadying herself for the journey ahead. Jefferson High had undergone a remarkable transformation in the past year. The once homogeneous administration now boasted a diverse array of faces and backgrounds. New inclusive policies adorned the walls, their colorful posters a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the past. As Ms. Thompson gazed at her students, she saw a reflection of the change she had fought so hard to achieve, yet, even in this new era of progress, old habits died hard. Just yesterday, a colleague had made an offhand comment about Ms. Thompson's hair, the microaggression hanging in the air like a bitter aftertaste. But where once she might have swallowed her discomfort, Ms. Thompson now felt empowered to address such incidents head-on. She had calmly explained why the comment was inappropriate, watching understanding dawn in her colleagues' eyes. As she began her lesson, Ms. Thompson's mind wandered to the group of new teachers she had been mentoring. Their eager faces and passionate ideals reminded her of herself, before the weight of discrimination had threatened to crush her spirit. She shared her experiences with them, offering guidance on navigating the complex world of education as a person of color. Their gratitude and determination fueled her own resolve to continue pushing for change. News of Ms. Thompson's legal battle had spread far beyond the walls of Jefferson High. She received messages from educators across the country, sharing their own stories of discrimination and thanking her for her courage. Some had been inspired to speak out in their own schools, challenging long-standing practices that marginalized teachers and students of color. The ripple effect of her actions filled Ms. Thompson with a sense of purpose larger than herself. In the quiet moments between classes, Ms. Thompson often found herself reaching for her phone, her mother's number on speed dial. Their relationship had deepened in ways she never could have imagined, forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. They laughed together over the absurdities of the legal process, cried over the painful memories it had dredged up, and celebrated each small victory along the way. The bond between them was now unbreakable, a testament to the power of family in the face of adversity. As Ms. Thompson looked out at her students, their faces alight with curiosity and potential, she felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. These young minds represented the future she had fought for, a future where every child could see themselves reflected in positions of authority and respect. She knew the road ahead was still long, that there would be more battles to fight and more minds to change. But in this moment, standing before her class, Ms. Thompson allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had accomplished. With a smile playing at the corners of her mouth, Ms. Thompson launched into her lesson. Her voice rang out clear and confident, filling the room with the promise of knowledge and understanding. As she spoke, she carried with her the hopes and dreams of every educator who had ever felt silenced or marginalized. Her struggle had paved the way for a more inclusive future in education, and she was ready to lead the charge into this new chapter. Ms. Thompson stood at the front of her classroom, her eyes sweeping over the eager faces before her. The journey that had brought her to this moment played through her mind, the whispered insults, the crushing isolation, the courtroom battles that had pushed her to her limits. But as she met the gaze of her students, a warmth spread through her chest. Her story was more than just a personal triumph. It was a beacon of hope for every educator who had ever felt silenced, every student who yearned to see themselves represented in positions of authority. The fight against racial discrimination in education was far from over, but Ms. Thompson's voice had cracked open the door to change. As she began her lesson, her words carried a new weight. She knew that beyond these walls, her story was inspiring others to speak out, to challenge the status quo in their own schools and communities. The ripples of her actions were spreading, slowly but surely reshaping the landscape of education. Ms. Thompson's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and determination. The road ahead would not be easy, but she was ready to face whatever challenges lay in wait. Her journey from victim to advocate had shown her the true power of raising her voice against injustice. And now, standing before her class, she silently vowed to continue fighting for a future where every child could see themselves reflected in the world around them.